The late afternoon sun dipped low over the city, painting the streets in amber light. Families strolled along the sidewalk. Couples shared laughter over coffee, and children tugged their parents toward the glow of a small ice cream shop at the corner. Amidst the cheerful noise, a single father stood still, his little girl in tears at his side. Her cries echoed louder than the hum of passing cars. The father, David, knelt beside her, his eyes filled with a helpless tenderness. He carried the weariness of someone who had faced too many battles alone, and though he tried to comfort her, his own grief weighed heavy on his shoulders. Since his wife's passing, every day had been a delicate balancing act between being strong for his daughter and carrying the silence of his own heartache. As passers-by glanced their way, some offered sympathetic smiles while others looked away. It was then that a young woman emerged from the ice cream shop, holding 2 cones of melting sweetness. She noticed the little girl's tears, her steps slowing, her gaze softening. With a quiet gentleness, she approached and offered 1 cone to the child. The girl sniffled, hesitated, then reached out with small fingers to take it. In that moment, the crying ceased. The ice cream worked like magic, but even more powerful was the kindness behind the gesture. David's eyes lifted to meet the woman's, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to pause. There was something disarming in her presence, not pity, not obligation, but a genuine warmth that made his guarded heart stumble. The 3 of them stood together under the fading light, an unspoken connection weaving through the simplest of moments. For the little girl, it was joy rediscovered in the swirl of vanilla and chocolate. For David, it was a realization that a stranger's kindness could ease a burden he thought he had to carry alone. For the woman, it was the instinctive act of reaching out, not knowing it would ripple into something far greater. As the evening breeze carried the scent of summer through the air, David found himself lingering in conversation with her, not in words spoken aloud, but in the silent comfort of shared presence. She laughed softly as the girl smeared ice cream on her cheeks, and David's chest tightened with something he had not felt in years. It was not just gratitude, it was possibility. Yet, even as the moment felt fragile and new, shadows lingered nearby. From across the street, unseen by David, a pair of eyes watched closely. His late wife's best friend, someone who had stood by him through grief, stood frozen in disbelief at the sight before her. To her, this was not a sweet beginning, but betrayal. She turned away with her heart pounding, convinced that moving on so soon was a wound to the memory of the woman they both loved. The night would close around them, but the seeds of connection had already been planted, seeds that would bloom into love, or perhaps into conflict. The path ahead was uncertain, but undeniable. And so, what began as a simple act of kindness over ice cream became the start of a story neither of them had expected. The next morning dawned with the weight of routine. David packed his daughter's school bag, tied her hair into a ponytail, and reminded her to finish her breakfast. Yet, beneath the ordinary rhythm, his mind kept circling back to the previous evening, the moment when a stranger's kindness had dried his daughter's tears. He told himself it was nothing, just a fleeting encounter. But deep within, something stirred that he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The little girl, still clutching the memory of ice cream and laughter, chattered happily about the nice lady. For David, hearing his daughter's excitement was bittersweet. He wanted her to smile more often, to feel the innocence of childhood without the heavy silence of loss. That woman, whoever she was, had managed to gift them both a glimpse of light, and it lingered with him all morning. Later that week, as fate would have it, David found himself walking past the same cafe where the ice cream shop stood. His daughter tugged his hand, her eyes sparkling as she begged to stop for another cone. Reluctantly, he agreed. Inside, the sweet scent of freshly baked pastries filled the air, and the quiet hum of people lost in conversation wrapped around them. And there she was, the same woman, balancing a tray of coffee cups and smiling warmly at a group of students seated by the window. When her eyes met David's, a flicker of recognition passed between them, the kind of recognition that felt less like chance and more like destiny nudging them together again. She approached, offering a smile that carried both familiarity and curiosity. David's daughter beamed, clearly delighted by the reunion, and the woman knelt to greet her with the same tenderness as before. For David, watching them together filled him with a complicated blend of joy and hesitation. His heart wanted to lean into this warmth, but his mind whispered caution. He had promised himself that love was no longer his path, that his focus would remain only on his daughter. Still, the conversation unfolded naturally. They found themselves talking longer than they intended, about simple things like the best flavors of ice cream, the chaos of balancing life, and the quiet beauty of small moments. Every word, though ordinary, seemed to weave an invisible thread between them. It was as though life was quietly reminding David that companionship was not betrayal, and kindness was not weakness. Yet, outside the cafe window, the shadow of disapproval loomed once again. His late wife's best friend stood across the street, watching silently, her heart heavy with judgment. She saw the smiles, the ease of their connection, and felt anger burn in her chest. To her, it was a betrayal of loyalty, a sign that David's grief had vanished too quickly. She clenched her fists, vowing to confront it before this fragile bond grew into something permanent. For now, though, David remained unaware of the storm gathering beyond the cafe walls. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he left with his daughter's laughter echoing beside him and the warmth of another soul lingering in his chest. The days that followed unfolded with an ease David had almost forgotten was possible. Each evening, when work ended and his daughter's school day was done, the two of them would often find themselves strolling near the cafe. Sometimes it was intentional, other times it felt like coincidence, but somehow the path always led to her. The woman greeted them not as strangers, but as though she'd been waiting all along, ready to welcome them into the warmth of her smile. David noticed the changes in his daughter first. Her laughter became fuller, her eyes brighter, her steps lighter. She talked endlessly about the woman, about her kindness, her gentle ways, and how she always remembered her favorite ice cream flavor. For David, seeing his daughter's spirit slowly heal was a gift more precious than anything he could name. It made him grateful but also frightened, for with every passing day, he knew he was allowing someone new into the fragile space of their lives. Yet, while joy began to return to their little family, shadows gathered in silence. His late wife's best friend, Evelyn, watched carefully from a distance. She had been there through the pain of loss, helping him with his daughter when grief was too heavy to carry. To her, his love for his wife should remain untouchable, preserved forever like a sacred memory. Seeing him smile with another woman felt like a wound to her loyalty, and in that wound, bitterness began to grow. One afternoon, as David lingered at the cafe, Evelyn appeared at his doorstep. Her voice, though measured, carried the sharp edge of accusation. She spoke of promises unspoken, of loyalty owed to the woman he had lost. In her eyes, David was betraying the memory of his wife, moving on too quickly, allowing another woman to replace what should never be replaced. David listened in silence, his heart torn between guilt and the truth he dared not admit, that what he was finding was not replacement, but renewal. Evelyn's words, however, did their work. That night, as he tucked his daughter into bed, the weight of doubt pressed on him. Could he really allow himself to feel something for this woman who had entered their lives so unexpectedly? Did love, once given and lost, have the right to return? His mind told him no, but his heart whispered otherwise. The following day at the cafe, his demeanor was different. He was quieter, reserved, carrying the heaviness of Evelyn's warning. The woman noticed, though she said nothing, her eyes searching as though trying to understand the storm behind them. His daughter, innocent to the weight of adult fears, continued to beam with joy, her hand clutching the woman's as if she had already accepted her place in their lives. Unbeknownst to David, Evelyn had no plans of stopping at words alone. Her disapproval was turning into determination. She knew the cafe manager, and she knew whispers could ruin reputations. If kindness could not keep David away, perhaps shame and pressure would. The bond forming before her eyes was fragile, and she intended to shatter it before it became unbreakable. The cafe, once a place of comfort, began to feel different. David noticed a change almost immediately, though he couldn't put his finger on it at first. The staff, usually cheerful and welcoming, exchanged quiet glances when he walked in. The warmth in their greetings seemed muted, replaced by a cautious politeness. It was as though an invisible wall had risen between him and the small world where he and his daughter had begun to feel a home. Behind the counter, the manager's eyes followed him closely. His polite words carried no malice on the surface, but David sensed a judgment hidden beneath them. The whispers had begun, seated carefully by Evelyn. She spoke of him as a man unable to let go of the past, yet foolish enough to grasp at new love too soon. To some, it was pity, to others, scandal. But to the manager, it was a threat to the woman he secretly admired, though he had never confessed it aloud. For the waitress, the tension was painful to bear. She felt torn between her growing bond with David and the unspoken pressure of her workplace. The cafe had been her sanctuary, a place where she had built a life after her own struggles, but now it felt heavy with disapproval. Still, she could not deny the connection that had blossomed between her and the quiet father who carried both grief and gentleness in his eyes. She saw the way his daughter trusted her, and in that trust, she found a reason to stay near them, no matter what others said. David, however, struggled with doubt. Evelyn's warnings echoed in his mind. He wondered if he was being selfish, if allowing his bond to grow meant betraying the love of the woman he had lost. At night, he replayed memories of his wife, her laughter, the promises they had shared, the life they had built. Guilt wrapped around him like a cold chain, tugging him back every time he dared to imagine a new chapter. And yet, each time he thought of stepping away, his daughter's joy pulled him forward again. She spoke of the woman with a light in her eyes that David hadn't seen in years. It was not just about ice cream or kindness. It was about the feeling of having another figure of care, someone who filled the quiet spaces that had once been only echoes. His daughter's heart was already opening, and David feared what would mean to close it again. But the controversy around them grew sharper. Evelyn began visiting the cafe herself, sitting in the corner with sharp eyes, ensuring her presence was felt. The manager grew colder, his jealousy now thinly veiled, and the townspeople, always eager for something to talk about, spun their own stories about the single dad and the waitress who seemed to linger at his side. What had started with an act of kindness over ice cream was now a storm of judgment and interference. David found himself standing at a crossroads, caught between the past he still honored, the future that beckoned with quiet hope, and the walls of society that threatened to crush both. The tension reached its breaking point on a quiet evening when David returned to the cafe with his daughter. He had hesitated all day, torn between staying away to avoid judgment and returning because his little girl had asked so sweetly. Her innocent heart carried no burden of gossip, no chains of the past. For her, the cafe was still a place where kindness lived, where her father's heavy silence softened into something lighter. As they entered, the atmosphere shifted. A few heads turned, whispers buzzed low, and the manager's disapproving glance cut through the air. Evelyn sat in the corner again, her presence deliberate and unyielding. Her eyes followed every step, like a warning he could not escape. For a moment, David considered leaving, retreating into the safety of solitude. But then his daughter tugged at his hand and smiled. That simple, radiant smile reminded him why he was there, not for himself, but for her. The waitress greeted them with warmth that defied the coldness around her. Though she felt the weight of every judgmental eye, she chose to meet David's gaze with steadiness. She had learned something in those weeks. Love, in its purest form, was never about what others allowed. It was about what hearts chose, even in silence. As they settled at the table, Evelyn finally rose from her seat. She moved toward them with deliberate grace, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room's hum. Her words were laced with accusation, a reminder of the past David was betraying, of the woman he had lost and the promise she believed he was breaking. The whispers grew louder. For the first time, the little girl sensed the hostility. Her eyes clouded with confusion and fear. David felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His instinct was to shrink, to retreat, to protect his daughter from the scene unfolding. But then he looked at her again and saw something else, the reflection of himself, the man she would learn from, the example he was setting. Would she grow up believing love was something to be ashamed of? That kindness had to be silenced because others disapproved? Or would she learn that courage sometimes meant standing tall, even when the world tried to bend you? So, for the first time since he had lost his wife, David stood with a steady resolve. He did not answer Evelyn with anger, nor did he lower his head in shame. He simply placed a protective arm around his daughter and turned toward the waitress with a quiet strength that spoke louder than words. It was not a declaration of love yet, not a promise of forever, but it was a choice to not let fear or judgment define their story. The room fell silent, the whispers fading into stillness. The manager's glare softened into uncertainty, Evelyn's certainty cracked into disbelief, and the waitress's eyes filled with a fragile, hopeful light. David's daughter, sensing his courage, smiled again, clutching his hand as though she had never been prouder. The cafe felt different then. No longer a battlefield of judgment, but the place where a single dad chose to begin again. Love had not yet fully bloomed, but the seed was planted in that moment, nurtured by kindness, watered by courage, and destined to grow despite the storms around it. Because sometimes, the greatest goodbye is not to the person you've lost, but to the fear that keeps you from living again. And in that goodbye, David and his daughter found the courage to welcome something new, an ice cream before a new beginning. If you enjoyed the story, rate it out of 10 in the comments, and don't forget to like the video.